So it's really great to be here. I still try to give a bit of a different focus, and actually the way I want to set this up is to say we shouldn't be that gloomy, we should be much more positive, because one of the messages I try to convey is actually that we have already embarked on a substantial transition towards sustainability. That transition might not be visible in a number of indicators yet, but in particular in the realm of governance, in the realm of institutional innovation, and that's what I try to show you. We have made some progress in the last 15 to 20 years. The Paris Agreement is one of those examples. And Frank has alluded to those trends already. We see more actors joining in. We see a multitude of governance approaches at various levels, and that is, in my understanding, creating a quite thick, dense network of governance that is really hard to undo by one person that doesn't believe in the science. Right. Of course, that is maybe a bit wishful thinking, so I try to hedge that a bit by saying, obviously, we can improve what we're doing because we have to. There is an urgency to what we discuss here, because this is in a way a luxury that we can sit here and discuss what we should do about things we should have done some 20 years ago. So there are some things we can improve, and that is what I will address in the latter part of my presentation. What are some of the conditions for more effective engaging, for more and better and quicker institutional innovation in governing planetary crises and the Anthropocene? All right, so I can keep very brief my remarks about the Anthropocene. There are other people among the speakers that have more insights into that. I just want to share with you my own interpretation of what we're discussing, including what Frank has also alluded to, the normative implications. What is actually the vision that we have about how we govern the Anthropocene, not only in terms of procedures and process, but also where do we want to go? What is actually the end state, if you want to say so. I want to spend some time also outlining the challenges of the Anthropocene concept for governance. Also, this was a bit in Frank's presentation. I want to spend a bit more time. For me, there are three challenges. One is the urgency to act. The second is the question of responsibility that came up. Who's actually agent in the Anthropocene? And the third one is complexity. We essentially discuss systems that are not linear anymore, they're complex. So actually, how do we govern systems that have emergent properties? And that seems to me a major challenge for governance research that so far has been very much into a sort of Newtonian, straightforward, positive way of understanding the world, cause and effect, and you have a good idea, you just need to implement it. It never works, why? And then everyone is surprised. Okay, and then I want to discuss with you some empirical findings to actually show you that the shifting of the scales, as I like to call it, is already happening. I want to talk about institutional innovation in the realm of climate governance, and then end with 4 conditions for improving planetary governance. All right, so on the Anthropocene, I think we cannot really add much. Just my observation here, it's really a Janus phase, the Roman god. You see here Janus with the 2 faces, a Janus phase situation in which we have to acknowledge our own ingenuity and progress. On the one hand, that unfortunately creates all these negative implications that we observe. So the Anthropocene is both something to be proud of, some people say. We have achieved a lot in the last thousands of years in terms of civilization and understanding of the world, but it comes, and that is a rather recent revelation, at really huge costs. These are not equally shared, obviously, but those costs are understood to be planetary. So we have this idea of humans being a geological force, so like a volcano, plate tectonics, or bacteria. We engage in shaping the Earth. We already heard about that. There are different propositions for when the Anthropocene starts, right? So is it 1945 in July when the Americans exploded the first nuclear weapon, or is it before in the Industrial Revolution, and so on, so on, going back to 3000 BC, first city-states emerging. Well, the important revelation, I think, is we are already in the Anthropocene, however you want to see that. So it's not about something new, it's actually understanding that we're in an historic geological process in which humans gradually have increased their agency. And the interesting thing to ponder about is that, well, that is not new, in the sense there were other events, but also other species. This is cyanobacteria that have oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere, to which we then essentially adapted. So we're not the first species that radically changes the planet. We're just the first one, arguably, that understands that. So we have this self-reflective capacity. And that puts us normatively in a different situation, because we know that we're doing something wrong. What does that mean? So I like this quote from journalist and writer Andrew Refkin, who said, basically, we're the first species that becomes a planetary scale influence and is aware of that reality, and that is what essentially distinguishes us. So the question for me then is, what do we do with that self-reflection? So where do we take that? And obviously there's this great debate in the Anthropocene where we want to basically go. Is the Anthropocene the time of, human hybrids, or is it actually a time of reflection? Can we go back to the Holocene? These are important questions. Now, normatively, I would say what we need to do, and that is quite ambitious, I agree, is we need to find a balance between space for development of humans, human societies, in all its breadth and diversity, and we need to have space for the development and further evolution of the rest. That is the planetary systems, ecology, ecosystems. And I want to make that a bit more challenging. It's not just to allow space for development. We need space for emancipation. And that is, I think, very clear in what Frank has said. The world is hugely unequal, it's unjust, it's just a mess if you want to say so. We need space to emancipate the human race, but we also need to allow for emancipation of all the other species and systems. Think like the mountain was a slogan for Aldo Leopold in the 1940s, so we need to take that thinking into account when we want to strike a balance between those demands. And that is obviously very, very difficult, it's very ambitious, and I'm not claiming that we have really understood that, but I would say that we have made some steps in the right direction. And I think it's important these days not to be too cynical about what we can and have achieved. All right, now, the Anthropocene, understood like this as a geological force of humans, puts a number of, challenges in front of the idea of governance, which, if you put it very simply put, is the idea that there's a problem and then we find some solution to that problem. Right? It's problem solving. Now, the Anthropocene would question that sort of linear approach in at least three ways. And I want to discuss them briefly with you. The first is the matter of urgency. So if you think about what we discuss here, we discuss actually intervening in systems that have long-term effects. So climate change, you can maybe reverse in 1,000 years. The nuclear debris of testing will be reversed in the scale of million years. I don't know, plastic pollution in the deep sea, we don't even know how long that takes to restore. Deep sea mining, a couple of 100,000 years, maybe a million years until the ocean floor recovers. So we are talking about long-term impacts, and even if we act now, long-term restoration, if at all. But we talk about doing this rather now, actually better yesterday. Now, a recent study in Nature Communications gives us basically 10 years to reverse emission trends, so we need to embark on emissions reduction, so the peak needs to be somewhere between now and 2026, 27, so that's not that long. As a collective, we need to really find that peak. So we discussed the urgency of those problems, and we still actually, as Frank has also alluded to, try to figure out how we're going to do that politically. All right, so that's one challenge. The next one has already been talked about quite a bit, and I think it's really important that we do this idea of responsibility, not evenly distributed. So the Anthropocene, in terms of agency, is not everyone's Anthropocene to the same degree, but actually people sitting in this room will have different footprints, will have different lifestyles, and that becomes important when we try to understand what to do. So one risk is that we say, well, we are a geological force, everyone, so everyone needs to act in a certain way. Now when you just look at the cumulative CO2 emissions from 1850 to today, you see that basically two country blocks, so the EU 28 and the United States of America, cover 50% of all the historic emissions. So 50% of climate change as a problem is made by a couple of countries. And if you want to break that down, in the EU 28, it's actually the UK, it's actually France and Germany that carry the majority of that, and the United States. So it's down to 4 countries maybe that have roughly 50% of the problem. Obviously, those 4 countries cannot act on the problem alone. They need others. And that creates, of course, all the political debates we have on climate change. Now, the third challenge of the Anthropocene is the immense complexity, the complexity of coupled natural and social systems, but also increasingly the complexity of governance itself. Maybe not everyone knows that we have around 1,000 international contracts on the environment. So we have 1,000 multilateral treaties that deal with environment. That's not little regulation, that's a lot. Right? And they have interactions among each other, so they're not, in other words, strictly separated, because they, in a way, interact. And we haven't really begun to understand that. All right, so that, in my view, calls for a new way to think about complexity of governance in the Anthropocene. And one way to illustrate this is this figure. Many people have seen that before. There's obviously a difference whether you deal with a complicated or simple system, or complex or even chaotic system. That is, governance and policy making cannot have the same recipes for different types of situations. But what we often do is we follow recipes that are proven in simple situations. So we would go out and sense, which is measure, we would make categories, and then we would respond. And we would actually think that our responses would do the trick, but they don't. And that is because often we find some sort of feedback loops that we haven't thought about, some emergent properties. And in that situation, so that is in the complexity quadrant up in the left top, what we need to do is we need to actually be much more experimental. We need to be much more adaptive. We need to really change our mindset in terms of governing. And that is something that hasn't happened so far to the necessary degree, I would say. So these are huge challenges, actually, when we think about how to do all the things that Frank has outlined, how to reform the United Nations, how to think about different voting systems, and how to involve a host of non-state actors. All of those are important things to do, but they are difficult to achieve. All right. Now, my argument is that although this is the case, there is some room for optimism. Yeah. And so I have two ways of showing that. Either I show you a glass, which is sort of half full, I would always argue, or show you these scales, and the argument here would be, when we think about system change, so there's a system changing from one state into another, when the change is underway, you do not necessarily know that. That's because you're part of the system, right? So you move, but you can't see that. So the question here is, are we actually seeing a tilting of those scales? Are we actually moving in a direction of a more sustainable way we do things? And many people say, I can't really see that. The indicators point in a really different direction. I think of the global outlooks on environmental indicators, I would agree. But on the other hand, there's a deeper, I would say, a deeper trend in terms of governance. It makes me cautiously optimistic, and I try to convince you in the remainder of my talk. And to begin with, and I added this after last night, now Trump's announcement wasn't really unexpected. It was in the making for some time. I heard from some people in Washington actually already a couple of days ago that it's decided, and others did that. So that wasn't a big surprise. It's also not a big departure from what he actually already said he will do, nor is it a big departure from what the United States has done over the past 20 years. They haven't been the major leaders in climate, obviously. But what is maybe more important, and I want to actually talk about the second bullet point here, is that maybe the news of yesterday isn't as important as the news of Wednesday, when this actually came out. And this reads that for the first time, the shareholders of the world's largest company that produces oil has decided with a majority of 62%. These are the investors, the people who want to make money. They have decided that Exxon needs to engage seriously in assessing and disclosing its business strategy on climate change. And that's the first time that this has passed. So usually these shareholder motions get some 20%, 25, 30, 62% is a landslide. It's a real change. And well, it's interesting because this is the old company of the current foreign minister of the United States, and that actually was against what happened. So some people say that is much more important than Trump doing things. And I could actually quote a lot more of those indicators. So there was this open letter of a number of American companies in the New York Times that you might have seen. There were all these statements after yesterday by various actors saying, we will go ahead. So you know that Trump said it's Pittsburgh, not Paris, right? Mm-hmm. Now the mayor of Pittsburgh said no. No, we will actually do what Paris asked us to do. Yeah, and that is, I think, really important. Come back to that. The world is no longer an international world where leaders sit among themselves and take decisions, as Frank has outlined. It is a world that is a bit more complex, It might not be perfect, it might not be uneven, but it's definitely much more interesting than the one we have seen in the 19th century, as Frank has said. All right, now I want to talk a bit about this, the institutional innovation that we have seen, about the fact that we have a host of actors engaging, that we have multiple mechanisms of doing things, not only control and command regulation type of things. It's a much broader, also people say obviously softer and more voluntary way of doing things. It's multi-level, as I have already alluded to. So it's the Pittsburghs, it's maybe the Californias that will be important, and not so much the federal states. And it's also about acknowledging the complexity of the governance system, emerging properties that we see there. So actually feedback loops among the things that we have basically set up in isolation that could potentially be interesting to look at. All right, so now I want to do this with a couple of examples from the climate change issue area. I think it's very topical. It's also what I do in my own research recently. So everyone was very happy when this came about. These are officials, these are international leaders, it's the United Nations, it's the French government, it's the United Nations Secretariat, you see. But arguably, this is only a tiny part of what we need to consider to be climate governance in 2015, 16, and 17. In other words, maybe climate governance is much more populated. It's not just an international treaty, which is very important. And this is a way to show this. It's called the governance triangle. It was developed by colleagues Duncan Snidel and Ken Abbott. It's basically trying to put institutional structures or mechanisms where they belong, qua their actors that are engaging in them. So if they're only public actors, so think of governments or international organizations of cities, they would go in this triangle up there in number 1. But if they're shared among governments and businesses and civil society, they would go in number 7. And if they're pure, they're just firm or they're just non-profit, they would go in the others. And what this is actually is a recent mapping of the climate governance field, only including those which act on mitigation. So that excludes all the things that happen on adaptation. And we have basically found some 90 international or transnational, so the national is excluded, so global in a way. We have found some 90 institutions that engage in climate governance. So it's not just the UNCCC, it's not just what Trump is doing, it's all those other things here. In particular, all the networks among cities and the networks among companies that also Frank has already talked about, the bottom up, in other words. All right, and so that is just to show that it has grown tremendously over time. So this triangle, in a way, has filled up in the last 20 years, because in 1990 it was all public and was just a handful of institutions, the IPCC, and then a bit later the United Nations Framework Convention. But by 2015 you see some 90 plus institutions governing climate change, and they're roughly tripartite in terms of being public or private or mixed. So the real diversity going on here that has transformed the system. That is, I would say, a real innovation. Now, a recent book by Anne-Marie Slaughter asked, is the world a chessboard or is it a web? And Anne-Marie Slaughter is an international foreign policy scholar in the US. And the answer would be it's a web. And I just want to show you this. These are the same data points I showed you on the triangle. That just shows whether they are linked through a website. Yeah? So that shows that they are not isolated things, but they actually relate to each other through the virtual, in a virtual policy network. That's how you call it, right? So dense interactions. The world is really a web. All right, and then another thing I want to stress is that you can say, well, whether it's one institution, right, or 90, what's the difference? Well, one interesting thing is to say, so who's actually participating in those little data points? I haven't talked about the details, what that is, but just think about a city network, right? So here I have a breakup of the different members in the different zones, and we have counted some 13,000 organizations which are members to those 90 institutions. So 196 are countries. Where's the rest? Well, there's some 7,000 cities, some 2,000 companies, some 1,000 NGOs, some 100 international organizations, and so on and so on. So it's a really broad set of actors engaging. And this is just one issue area. It's just climate change, right? And there are others. forestry, fisheries, biodiversity, you have it. And everywhere we see the same picture because I do research on all of those and do the same analysis. So we see this incredible dense web of institutionalization that I believe is the foundation on which we will move ahead. It's not saying that there are no conflicts here. It's not saying that everything moves in the same direction or everything is organized in the right way. It's just say it is there and it potentially is a good thing. All right. Now, if you don't believe me, which is fine, I just want to say you can also look at that a bit more from an implementation side. So you can say, okay, all those things, what are they actually doing, right? What are the effects? One is that we can see clear indication of change, for example, in the renewable field, where we see more investment in renewables than in coal and gas. We've seen a record new installations for the first time, 2015, surpassing the installations in fossils for the first time. More added capacity in electricity and power generation was from renewables than it was from coal. And that is why I believe that this idea about Pittsburgh being more important than Paris is wrong. It's actually wrong when you look at the price, because Pittsburgh coal cannot compete with the current price of wind and solar, which you see here has gone down tremendously in the last 20, 30 years. Okay, so that is for me also a sign that we're moving slowly in the right direction. Other examples could be the host of companies that today are accountable to someone, at least. Frank mentioned the important question of accountability. So 1,000 companies report their actual emissions to you. You can look them up on the web. 80% of those, 85% of those companies have set internal reduction targets. So the United States says we don't do anything, and roughly 900 global multinational companies say, well, we have actually a plan, right? And there are actually more that don't report. And finally, also, on a different scale, we see this explosion of soft governance. So there's also a type of innovation that you see labeling, and you can be critical about it if you like. That's also important. But you just see this immense increase of tools that try to give the consumer, the citizen, everyone actually an ability to decide whether to fly somewhere, to buy something, to do something. And this has been a major revolution in the last 10, 15 years with 465 international global eco-labels being available today. Okay, there's always a but, and that is, I don't want to be naive, so I say, well, this is not bad, but it can be better. It needs to be improved, and that's because of the urgency and the complexity and the responsibility issues I've outlined. So these are 4 propositions I would have: how to scale up, how to speed up, how to improve the current system of planetary governance. And that is nothing we can do overnight. It's something that will take some time, but I would say it is underway and it can be strengthened. My 4 points. Experimentation. That has to do with the complexity challenge. We need to more seriously engage in policy making, in governance that is experimental, in the sense that we shouldn't think about the tried out ways to do things, and we shouldn't think about the usual cycles of evaluation that we have. We need to be more flexible. We need to be also actually accepting failure in a different way than we have done before. We need to be better in involving what I would say diverse views, 7 billion counting people, and all are different. Frank has also alluded to that. We treat the world if they were not. We could just make them simple and say, well, there's a couple of countries. But we need to be more diverse in our governance, and that requires collaborative learning. We need to learn how to learn together. And that's really difficult. Even a place like this, a learning institution, a university, we still come here to these meetings and say, that's really great that we engage in interdisciplinary research and that we talk, we have this discussion, and all of those from different schools are here. That should be the norm, not the exception. Why is that? Because we need to understand how differences work. We need to put ourselves in different shoes to understand how we can challenge the Anthropocene. Which leads me to the 3rd point. It has been made by Frank and others. We also need to be more political. And when I say we, you can decide who that is. And engaging politically is maybe different from being political. It means engaging. And that has to say we need to not only ask the questions about distribution and power, we need to basically live them. We need to have them. And that is a self-reflective comment of academia. Is it still sufficient to judge people by whether they publish in Nature or Science? Or is it maybe time to think about our own academic standards, how we would evaluate relevance and success? And I'm not saying that I know how to do that, I just say we have a discussion, and that's an important one. And then finally, to improve institutional innovation, to improve governance innovation, we need to be more holistic and connective, and that is also something for research. So we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is great. But if you look at them, they're all connected. So they're not just boxes and silos, they're actually a connected system. So how do you actually do research on those? How do you acknowledge the fact that everything, well, maybe very basic observation, might hang together with everything else? The typical scientific mode would be chop it up. And that makes good sense for many problems. It doesn't make sense for problems which are about complex systems, because a complex system is different from its constitutive parts. So can we really do research where one is an expert in forestry, and one is an expert in climate, and one is a lawyer, and you have it, you get the picture? Or do we need to go closer together? Right, we have to, and that might take a lot of adjustment from ourselves, because we like to be what we are, and we like to stick in our silos. But I would say that is an important prerequisite for scaling up and speeding up the sustainable transition, and that's very much about what we do here. And in that sense, I want to relate back to what Frank said. So the Earth System Governance Project is one of those examples where we come together and try to overcome those disciplinary differences. So I'm at the end of my talk, so just give you the two-liner. I think what Trump has said yesterday is irrelevant, because we have already embarked on a sustainable transition. Can it be better? Can it be quicker? Can it be more just and equitable? Yes. It is, in the end, for us to do that. Thanks.